Happy Sunday, everyone. Today I want to talk about these anti-Mormon arguments, perhaps a qualifier or a disclaimer at the beginning. I will be bringing some stuff up that has caused some people to struggle with their faith and their testimony and are reasons why some people have left the church. However, my intention today is to bring these things up to refute the claims, to address them, to show how many of these arguments, most of these arguments, almost all of these arguments are inaccurate, are misleading, are deceptive. And so this is not certainly an effort to give credence to any of these arguments, quite the opposite. My aim is to discuss how weak they are and how, well, I'll just start with my personal example. So contrary to what my mother has advised over the years, I have not stayed away from so-called anti-Mormon literature. I've read a lot of it. I'm very well familiar with a lot of the arguments and criticisms that have been made over the many, many, many years. And that's the thing about these arguments is very rarely do you find any novel arguments. Typically what you find are repackaged arguments. That is certainly the case with one that I will be highlighting today, and that is what is nicknamed or called the CES letter. The CES letter purports to be a document written by this guy named Jeremy. I met him years ago, and he portrays it as a good faith attempt to seek answers to the gospel, and that he had, written a letter to the CES person. CS is the church educational system, seminary institute, and someone was willing to engage with him and say, send me your questions, and he never got back to me. It's because these questions are so difficult, he couldn't handle them. And so it's meant to be or portrayed as this list of concerns for which the church has no answers, for which members or leaders of the church have no answers. And then the letter has gone viral, and basically the letter is a synthesis of all these different kind of arguments. And the narrative around how this letter came to be is just as duplicitous as are many of its arguments, because that's not how this letter was composed. This letter was composed on the ex-Mormon subreddit. Reddit is a social media website, for those who don't know, online forums basically. So there's an ex-Mormon forum on there. And this letter was crowdsourced. It was all these, bitter former Mormon type people who were looking for every argument they could, and they threw them all at Jeremy, and Jeremy synthesized them all, packaged them in this letter, and that's what we have today. So this is a crowdsourced effort of former Mormons and non-Mormons too, who want to try and find any argument they can to undermine the key faith claims of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, I should point out there's a bit of a distinction in my mind between, I guess, anti-Mormon attacks and maybe what I might call a subset of them, which is like ex-Mormon attacks, right? The anti-Mormon attacks are the ones that are like, oh, funny underwear, you're all crazy, or you claim you're going to have your own planets and be your own gods, that there is more than one God, that God has a God, right? Baptisms for the dead, temples, all these things. Anti-Mormon attacks, I think, generally speaking, are often kind of this non-Mormon criticism of some of the doctrines or aspects of the gospel. This subset that I'm going to be talking about today, that the CES letter falls into, certainly, is kind of ex-Mormon attacks. These are people intimately familiar with the faith claims of the gospel. They're not trying to attack the church just because some of its doctrines are uncommon or uncharacteristic of other Christian religions. They're instead trying to go for the foundational arguments of the church and the restored gospel, knowing that if they can undermine those key faith claims, then everything else flows from that. So these are more sophisticated arguments. They're more pointed. They're more highly specific, right? And that's what this letter boils down to. I'm going to be sharing a website a little bit later that I will recommend for those of you who are curious about anything that I bring up today, those of you who have friends or family members who are struggling with either the CES letter specifically or claims about the church or aspects of the church's history or other things like that. There's some good resources on this website that I'll share a little bit later, so stick around for that. Okay, the CES letter, as I said, I'm going to use this as the basis of my remarks today, just because I think it's the more common and more widely shared collection of, I'm just going to call them anti-Mormon attacks or criticisms. Okay, there have been other books, there have been other websites, pamphlets, and all the rest, right? Random social media posts and whatever. But the CES letter basically has been shared so often because it is this singular resource that just compiles all of these arguments, and that's important. I want to start there. In debate, there's this technique called the Gish gallop, and a Gish gallop is when you use a rapid series of arguments. They can be half truths, they can be deceptive, but you just throw all these arguments out there like a machine gun, right, at your opponent, and you do it in a short amount of time. You do it in rapid succession so that it is difficult for your opponent to be able to refute each and every one. So you're bringing up a lot of deceptive claims. You're making stuff up, but you're doing it so voluminously and so expeditiously that the other side can't reasonably fight back, because it takes them more time to refute and to respond to each of those individual claims than it does for them to have been articulated in the first place, right? Far easier to just machine gun all this crap at people, far more difficult to take the time to refute and respond to each of these claims one by one, which is why the CES letter has been so effective, is because it is the Gish gallop. It is, so here, this is from Rational Wiki, which is like a online wiki for critical thinking and even objectivism, atheism, all these people. But anyways, it had this good definition of Gish gallop. Although it takes a trivial amount of effort on the galloper's part to make each individual point before skipping on to the next, especially if they cite from a pre-concocted list of gallop arguments, a refutation of the same gallop may likely take much longer and require significantly more effort, per the basic principle that it's always easier to make a mess than to clean it back up again. That is what's going on here. That is what the CES letter does. It is a machine gun approach to all these criticisms meant to overwhelm the people who see it. And that is effective because our church culture, frankly, our broader culture, is such that we go off of headlines, right? It's social media. You see a headline, you assume it's true. People are not taking the time to critically think about what they're being told. They're not taking the time to research sources. I can't tell you how many people, I know a lot of people who have left the church, no longer believe the gospel's true, blah, 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 right? And the title of today's musing is taken from this concept that people will say, these questions I have, these doubts I have, I put them on a shelf, right? I'll put them up on the shelf and I'll just go about my business, keep, paying my tithing, going to church, reading my scriptures, right? But I'm going to put these things on the shelf. And then the idea from those who leave the church is that they're, quote unquote, their shelf broke because so many things were up on the shelf that the shelf could no longer support the mounting list of doubts and questions, so the shelf came crashing down, and then they leave the church. I know many people who fall into this camp, some who I consider very good friends. My experience with a lot of these people, I'm not going to say all of them, but a lot of these people is that they encountered the CES letter or things like it, and they were so overwhelmed by what appeared to be this well-researched, exhaustive list of problems, and they just run with it. They assume that it's accurate. They see, the CES, whatever he was, principal or whatever, he couldn't reply because the church doesn't have answers. And so then they just run with it, and they allow that to be the basis of their decision to depart from the faith. And so often these people, again, in my experience, do not take the time to research all of the counter arguments, to research the scholarship that points out that there are answers. They don't take the time to research the rebuttals to these claims, which would show, as I will here in a bit with a select portion of them, which show that it is a Gish gallop. They're half-truths, they're deceptive, they're taking things out of context. These people so often just respond and be like, oh my gosh, like it's overwhelming. It must all be accurate, or at least some amount. And if any amount is accurate, then the church must not be true, or the gospel must not be true, therefore blah, 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 blah. And so my experience has been, when I have the opportunity to sit down with people and point them to resources or counter arguments or reason with them, that they kind of pull back a little bit. Oh, yeah, I guess there are compelling arguments on the other side. Oh, I guess these people making these claims are trying to manipulate me, right? And they can walk off the ledge a little bit and back off and say, okay, maybe there's more nuance here. Maybe there's more answers. Maybe I need to take the time to research them. And few people do. They go off a headline, they go off a CES letter, and they assume that it's true, they assume that it's accurate, and then they direct their life accordingly. Okay, so I am not going to get into all the arguments and all the claims, but I do want to highlight a few, maybe some of the more high-level and significant ones, to show some examples. Again, I'm not going to be exhaustive. There's a long list of all these claims that are made, all these criticisms. I will point you a little bit later to a website that I'll recommend if you're interested in kind of going down these rabbit holes and learning more, and you got a little bit of thick skin to enter that realm. But I do want to highlight a few, because I think the examples that I will share will illustrate how deceptive and dishonest so many of these criticisms and claims are. And it's like with so many of Joseph Smith's critics, right? These people were just making stuff up, and they're signing these affidavits, and they're making up these wild accusations. And many of these people years later assume that those people and their claims are true, even though they were proven perjurers. It's like, why are we going to adhere to or follow or believe the ideas of people who are clearly being deceptive, right, over people with good faith kind of talking about available evidence and whatever, right, analyzing a concern or a question about some aspect of church history or doctrine? Like, wouldn't it be more insightful and truthful to focus on the people who are admitting uncertainty or historical lack of context or information, but still trying to work through the material and in good faith kind of say, well, what's possible and what's likely and so forth, versus the people who just throw these grenades from the sidelines, right? Ha ha ha, watch the destruction below, when oftentimes their intent is to cause harm to people's faith. They are not operating in good faith, and some of these examples will show it. Let's start with the Book of Mormon. Starting with the Book of Mormon is important because, as these former Mormons know, if they can undermine the validity of the Book of Mormon, they by implication undermine Joseph Smith, and then by implication the entire restored gospel and church. So attacking the Book of Mormon, the keystone of our religion, is a strategic imperative, and it's why so many of the criticisms focus there. So for example, here's from the CES letter. It says, what are 1769 King James Version edition errors doing in the Book of Mormon? So there's these purported errors in the 1769 King James edition of the Bible. What are they doing in the Book of Mormon? A purported ancient text. Errors which are unique to the 1769 edition that Joseph Smith owned. Okay, so this is a common tactic, raising these questions, sowing this doubt. This is crazy, right? If this is happening, clearly it's an indication that this must not be true. And it's just bringing up these questions without taking the time to actually review the available scholarship and research that has extremely convincing and plausible answers to these questions. But people reading letters like this that are just like throwing out all these Gish gallop questions that are with a specific intent to mislead and deceive, those individuals reading that are not equipped to respond oftentimes. So by contrast, to look at this question, let's consider the apostles in the New Testament, or even Jesus himself. When they're quoting the Old Testament, are they quoting the original Hebrew? Well, no, they're quoting phrases from the Greek translation of the Hebrew, the Septuagint, I think is how you pronounce it. That was what was being read at the time, right? Because they're speaking different languages. They're not doing the original Hebrew in a lot of these places. They're quoting the Septuagint. Well, why wouldn't they quote the original Hebrew? If this purports to be an accurate text, why would they be quoting a translation and not quoting the original source? Well, that was because that was the language that the audience passing around the books of New Testament were familiar with. Remember, the New Testament was just a collection of letters from apostles going around, and it was later that it was compiled into this record. So these people are passing around all these, apostolic letters. The language that they were conversing in was Greek. They were reading the Septuagint, not the original Hebrew. And so no wonder then the copiers were using the Septuagint as the basis for, so when Jesus would quote the Old Testament, they didn't go back to the Hebrew and translate again directly from the Hebrew. They were simply going off of the existing Greek translation with which their entire audience was familiar. So in Joseph's day, oftentimes the only book that people would own was the Bible. Overwhelmingly, it was the King James Version. There's some interesting stories behind why the King James Version was so popular. I talk about that in my book, Christ versus Caesar. But it was the King James edition that was the most common one. This is what people read from. It's what they studied from. It's the language of the people on the American frontier, all these, people going to these revivals and Methodist preaching and everything. The King James Bible was the vernacular of the time, just as during the early apostolic era, it was the Greek Septuagint, and that was the version of the Old Testament that they were doing. Why wouldn't the Book of Mormon, when citing Isaiah, for example, when Joseph is translating the Book of Mormon, why wouldn't he use the language with which everyone is familiar who he's speaking to? It's I think from that basis, kind of obvious. There's no witnesses that have any claim that Joseph read from a Bible when he was translating the Book of Mormon, right? He was not translating word for word. From all the available evidence that we have, what it appears was happening was Joseph was being presented with, line by line, these words to read. He wasn't consulting his King James Bible. There's no evidence he even owned a Bible at this period of time in his life when he was translating the Book of Mormon. The Bible of his childhood, his parents owned. He didn't live there anymore. He was a newlywed, super poor, didn't even have his own home, didn't own a Bible from anything that we can tell. So he's not consulting a Bible. He's not going to the King James Version and saying, okay, how is this stated and let's copy this. From every available evidence we have, he was just reading. So the more operative question is, why would God give him the words of the 1769 King James Bible, the purported errors that the CES letter is talking about? That is an interesting question, right? And the Book of Mormon itself says that God speaks unto man according to their own understanding and in their own language, right? It makes sense, just as Jesus and the apostles were talking using the Septuagint and not the original Hebrew, that God, in revealing new scripture, would use the conversational and biblical language of the time to communicate. It's why the thing is written in Shakespearean English. I mean, I would be fascinated to see if the Book of Mormon was translated today, right? It would be in, I would hope and think, modern English, right? Because the language of the people, and probably wouldn't because the Bible we use is still the King James and all the rest, but absent this silly Shakespearean cultural thing that we're clinging to because of the King James Version, the modern language that we speak in is modern English. And so God would give us new revelation, or God gives me revelation in my own language. When God speaks to me, when the Holy Ghost whispers to me, it's not in awkward Shakespearean Old English, it's in my language, right? So this is like a non-issue. In fact, there are parts of the Book of Mormon that are more accurate than the King James Version, because the King James translators were using, original text. They were using, for example, the Aramaic text that had been translated from the Hebrew, the Torah, 24 books, I think. Okay, this is called the Masoretic text. So the King James translators are using this Aramaic translation. And when you look at distinctions between the Book of Mormon and the King James version of the Bible, when it is quoting these Isaiah or other Old Testament scriptures, there are some differences. It's not just that the Book of Mormon supposedly has retained these errors, supposed errors from the 1769 version, it's that there are some differences as well. And when you go look at the underlying Hebrew, because there are, you look at the Isaiah scrolls found at Qumran, for example, you can identify that the Book of Mormon has more accuracy, more fidelity to the original Hebrew in some of these cases than does the King James Version, because they were going off of this Aramaic, the Masoretic text, right? The Aramaic translation of the Hebrew. And so to me, that's not a valid criticism of the Book of Mormon. It, in fact, is a witness, an evidence that the Book of Mormon is what it purports to be, that it came directly from God, because these aspects, just as one little example, are actually evidence that he wasn't copying and pasting from a Bible that he didn't even own at the time, right? It's that this was God speaking directly, not just in the language of the King James Bible, but even fixing some things and being more faithful to the original Hebrew. So I think examples like this actually strengthen the case for the Book of Mormon's claim, rather than undermining it, as was the goal of the CES letter. Here's another quote from the letter. There is absolutely no archaeological evidence to directly support the Book of Mormon or the Nephites and Lamanites, who were supposed to have numbered in the millions. All right, so this is a geographical claim. This is not a new one. There have long been claims that the Book of Mormon is a work of fiction, that all these things that it describes are non-existent. Horses and brass and iron and large cities and freeways and brass plates and all these things, right? So the criticism for many years has been that the Book of Mormon is fictional because none of those things exist here in America. There's been no archaeological evidence, as Runnels here described, which is just flat out asinine. It is wrong. If you were to go back to Joseph's era, if you compiled a list, in fact, there's in one of these resources I'll share, they have a image that shows this. They compile a list of all these things that I just rattled off and many more that were in the Book of Mormon. There's, 60 of them, right? Javelins, axes, oxen, wheat, barley, human sacrifice, right? Lakes, two advanced civilizations, stone monuments, thrones, right? So all of these archaeological-based things, the fact that the individuals could even read and write, right? All these claims that archaeology could prove or potentially disprove. And in Joseph's time, based on the knowledge at the time of archaeology and ancient American civilization, out of these 60 claims that originate from the Book of Mormon, 52 of them were unconfirmed, not known at the time, right? It was not known at the time, based on any available research or evidence, that there existed such a thing as Reformed Egyptian, or that there was a barley-based monetary system, or that natives could read and write, or that there were steel swords and brass plates and all these things. There was zero evidence, which is why 52 of the 60, 87%, were unconfirmed. So 8 had been, for example, wild beasts, stone monuments, large cities, fortifications, bows and arrows, Hebrew language, east and west seas. So there were a tiny handful, 8 in particular, of the 60, that at the time that Joseph published the Book of Mormon were known. But 87% of them were inaccurate, and there was no evidence of at the time, and with the understanding of Joseph and the best scholars, the most keep in mind this kid's a farm boy with basically one school of education. He has no access to all this high and mighty educational stuff, and yet the leading knowledge, the most available archaeological evidence at the time could only confirm 8 of the 60, 13%. Fast forward to today, almost 200 years later, okay? That number of unconfirmed shrinks from 87% to 25%. In other words, archaeological research, research of even language patterns and DNA and all the rest, all kinds of scientific research has shown that so many of these other claims that were not known at the time of Joseph have since been discovered, have since been shown to be connected in some form or fashion to ancient civilizations here in the Americas. And that includes things like the fact that there were thrones, that there was cement, that there was highways, military gear, costumes, swords, spears, javelins, slings, human sacrifice, right? All of these things, precious ore, barley, all of these things have since been discovered. So if you were Joseph making all these claims about what would be in there, that's a massive gamble to be specifically citing all these things if in fact it was fiction. If in fact the CES letter is accurate, that there's no archaeological evidence to support the Book of Mormon or the Nephites or the Lamanites, right? And once again, this is completely inaccurate. Just a few days ago, literally like 4 days ago, the Wall Street Journal published an article highlighting a discovery from, I think, 2015 was it Guatemala? I need to go look up the country. It was in Central America somewhere. And they found these super dense forests and like shrubs and trees and like everywhere. No habitable, what do you call it? No one inhabiting that area at all. And they found using LiDAR, like this form of radar, they could fly these low planes over and take scans of the area that would basically search through all the vegetation and map the terrain and identify all the stuff that was underneath. Here's a paragraph from this Wall Street Journal article. If you want, you could jot down a few of these words and then go Google it and find the actual article. I'll actually give you the title of the article. This is from January 30th, so about 6 days ago at the time I'm recording this. The title is Vast Maya Kingdom is Revealed in Guatemalan Jungle. Again, like 6 days ago, Wall Street Journal. So here's a brief paragraph from the article. Archaeologists identified nearly 1,000 Maya settlements, not homes, full-on settlements, which they said were mostly built between 1000 BC and 150 AD. The findings tell a story of the rise and precocious development of an incredibly organized, sophisticated society. The LiDAR data, which took years to analyze, revealed the existence of previously unidentified canals, dams, terraces, quarries, causeways, temples, and ceremonial complexes. The researchers also identified ball courts once used for competitive sports. Doctors Hansen and Morales Aguilar said that they were surprised by the extent of the causeway network. More than 110 miles of raised roads in total. They and their colleagues called it the, quote, first freeway system in the world. They said, it shows the formation of a complex kingdom or state very early in Maya history, Dr. Hansen said, a broad geographical area unified by shared economic, political, and social values. Now, I am not one to claim that this particular period of Maya history in Guatemala is specifically the Book of Mormon people, or that the Book of Mormon people was as vast. When you read the geography, this was like a close-knit group that, yes, was intermarrying with outside groups and traveling around, but early Mormon thought was that like all the inhabitants in North and South America and Central America come from the Book of Mormon people. Like, no, right? This is a little kind of society intermingling with all these other societies. But, I mean, the fact that they call it the first freeway system in the world, I think of 3 Nephi 6, which says in verse 8, and there were many highways cast up and many roads made. I mean, highways cast up, and they said in their article, let's see, where did it say? Canals, the researchers, blah, blah, blah. There was some aspect in here talking about that they had, it was raised roads. Oh, there it is. More than 110 miles of raised roads in total. So 3 Nephi 6, there were many highways cast up and many roads made, which led from city to city and from land to land and from place to place. So the claim that there is no archaeological evidence at all, especially when the claims went in Joseph's time from only 13% of the claims being confirmed to now, 58% of them confirmed, 17% undetermined, could go either way, so there's some kind of question marks still, but only 25% unconfirmed. In my mind, this is the exact opposite of what is being claimed, and we're still finding things. We have this pretense of knowledge, this fatal conceit that we already know everything, that if we can't prove things right now with all our available research and scholarship and knowledge, that therefore it doesn't exist or couldn't be true. When, like, here's another example. These people have found this massive civilization in the forest in 2015. And here in 2023, we're just kind of getting the data and learning about it. Like, it is such a fatal conceit to think, a ridiculous notion that because there's not particular evidence about X, Y, or Z, that therefore it can't be true. Certainly the claim that the CES letter is making that there's no available archaeological, like, it's just asinine. It is dishonest. It is deceptive, right? It is another example of this Gish gallop where the reader is being overwhelmed with all these claims that they are just accepting as true because they're being subjected to this machine gun fire of arguments that they don't know how to counteract. So total poppycock, total rubbish, absolutely wrong. And yet another example of the letter in particular, but the arguments in general, throwing crap at people trying to claim things that aren't in fact true. The CES letter goes on. Why are there so many names similar to the Book of Mormon names in the region where Joseph Smith lived? This is all just a coincidence? So it has this stupid little map in there that someone drew that here's what people claim is the Book of Mormon geography, and they show these places. I'm sorry, that's completely inaccurate. There is no reliable, agreed upon geography of the Book of Mormon. There are connections, like took them this long to travel here, there was a lake here, so there's some kind of relative understandings of the geography. Some people think that's in the northeast, up in kind of Joseph Smith's old stomping grounds. A lot of people think that's more Central America, like Guatemala and elsewhere. But there's no official version, and yet in the CS letter, they present side by side, here's the Book of Mormon geography, contrasted with the geography of Joseph's time. And they say, for example, look, 280 miles away from where Joseph Smith lived, there was a town called Alma. Therefore, the argument goes, that's where Joseph thought of the name. And that beyond that, there were all these other names of places around where he lived that he borrowed from when coming up with these names in the Book of Mormon. Again, throwing mud against the wall, hoping something sticks with these people reading this letter. Well, the inconvenient thing about the Alma example in New York, right, 280 miles away, which is a massive distance when you don't have cars and trains and the like, and young, ignorant Joseph with a limited, experience certainly is unlikely to know about a city 280 miles away. But even if he is, even if he were to be aware of all of the town and city names up to 280 miles away from his home, the city of Alma, or town, whichever it was first named in 1854, right? 2.5 decades after Joseph publishes the Book of Mormon. Does this show you, again, how deceptive and misleading these claims are? How ridiculous it is to claim that because there was an Alma near Joseph Smith, that he must have borrowed that name, and that's where he got it in the Book of Mormon, when it didn't even come until later. These other examples, they weren't even on the maps, the best available maps in 1820 of Joseph's time. For example, there was a city named Kishkiminitus, and so presumably that's where Joseph got Kishkumen. Or there was Shiloh. That must be where he got Shilom in the Book of Mormon. Or Ramah, right? And so the CS letter has just these few examples. Oh, look, these are very similar to these. Therefore, Joseph must have... It's like, I'm sorry, but that represents a tiny fraction of all the many other names. So even if it's true that Joseph borrowed from or stole from or plagiarized the names of these places that he didn't even know about because they weren't on the maps at the time, and in the case of Alma was not even named for decades. Even if that's true, that's a tiny fraction of all the other people and place names in the Book of Mormon. But they're trying to like grasp at any little straw they can to say, aha, aha, aha. They don't have a broad thesis of how the Book of Mormon came out. They don't have a broader attack to undermine it. They just try and find any little argument they can and then poke at it when each particular claim is so weak, as in this case of saying that he must have known about a town that wasn't named for 25 more years. Then there's the Captain Kidd example. So the letter says that off the eastern coast of Mozambique in Africa is an island country called Comoros. Prior to its French occupation in 1841, the islands were known by its Arabic name, Camorra. There is an 1808 map of Africa that refers to the islands as Camorra. The largest city and capital of Comoros, formerly Camorra, Moroni. Camorra and settlement Moroni were common names in pirate and treasure hunting stories involving Captain William Kidd, a pirate and treasure hunter, which many 19th century New Englanders, especially treasure hunters, were familiar with. So the argument is that Joseph Smith read the Captain Kidd stories, came across Camorra and Moroni, and that's how he came up with the names for the Book of Mormon. That's the argument here. The problem is that the novels about Captain Kidd, printed before 1830, do not mention Camorra and Moroni. Fascinating, curious, coincidental perhaps, that similar names have been come up with elsewhere here and there for Alma and Moroni. Big whoop. But in an effort to try and show that Joseph Smith directly borrowed from or plagiarized these names, they're relying upon things that simply could not have happened. It's ridiculous. The CES letter fails to provide a plausible explanation for the existence of the Book of Mormon, about how a 24-year-old, I think, farm boy with a year of education could have come up with a book like this. I recall, for example, if you've not heard of this, the Hugh Nibley challenge. Hugh Nibley, fascinating guy, scholar, professor, author, and a very brainiac kind of guy in the gospel. And he taught the Book of Mormon at BYU. You can get the audio, if not even the video, but certainly also the printed kind of the transcripts of his lessons from BYU when he taught. They're fascinating. And he had this exercise, this challenge that he would sometimes do with his students in their required Book of Mormon class at BYU. Here's what this challenge says. Hugh Nibley's challenge to his students. Since Joseph Smith was younger than most of you and not nearly so experienced or well-educated as any of you at the time he copyrighted the Book of Mormon, it should not be too much to ask you to hand in by the end of the semester, which will give you more time than he had, a paper of, say, 500 to 600 pages in length. Call it a sacred book, if you will, and give it the form of a history. Tell of a community of wandering Jews in ancient times, have all sorts of characters in your story, and involve them in all sorts of public and private vicissitudes. Give them names, hundreds of them, pretending that they're real Hebrew and Egyptian names of circa 600 BC. Be lavish with cultural and technical details, manners and customs, arts and industries, political and religious institutions, rites and traditions. Include long and complicated military and economic histories. Have your narrative cover 1,000 years without any large gaps. Keep a number of interrelated local histories going on at once. Feel free to introduce religious controversy and philosophical discussion, but always in a plausible setting. Observe the appropriate literary conventions and explain the derivation and transmission of your varied historical materials. Above all, do not ever contradict yourself. For now we come to the really hard part of this little assignment. You and I know that you're making this all up. We have our little inside joke. But just the same, you are going to be required to have your paper published when you finish it, not as fiction or romance, but as true history. After you've handed it in, you may make no changes to it. What's more, you are to invite any and all scholars to read and criticize your work freely, explaining to them that it is a sacred book on par with the Bible. If they seem over-skeptical, you might tell them that you translated the book from original records by the aid of a Urim and Thummim. They'll love that. Further, to allay their misgivings, you might tell them that the original manuscript was on golden plates and that you got the plates from an angel. Now, go to work and good luck. Nibley says, to date, no student has carried out this assignment, which, of course, was not meant seriously. But why not? If anybody could write the Book of Mormon, as we've been so often assured, it's high time that somebody, some devoted and learned minister of the gospel, let us say, performed the invaluable public service of showing the world that it can be done. Finally, to end on the Book of Mormon point before we go on to a couple other examples of critiques against the gospel, I think of Elder Holland's 2009 General Conference address when he gave his testimony of the Book of Mormon, in which he said, in part, for 179 years, this book has been examined and attacked, denied and deconstructed, targeted and torn apart like perhaps no other book in modern religious history, perhaps like no other book in any religious history, and still it stands. Failed theories about its origins have been born and parroted and have died, from Ethan Smith to Solomon Spaulding to deranged paranoid, talking about Joseph Smith, to cunning genius. None of these frankly pathetic answers for this book has ever withstood examination because there is no other answer than the one Joseph gave as its young, unlearned translator. As you read all of the CES letter criticisms about the Book of Mormon, these questions that are brought up, these accusations of which I've only shared a small number, the others are just as misleading and irrelevant and refutable as the ones I've shared. I come away with a stronger testimony of the Book of Mormon because it is exactly what Elder Holland just said. Time and again, these critics have tried to attack and say this and that and how he translated it and he came up with these names and the King James Version and the Isaiah verses and everything else. And there are plausible, reasonable, intellectually based, intellectually sound arguments to respond to the criticisms. It just requires you to actually go find them. They're not that hard to find. Again, I'll give you the website in a bit. They're out there. And I come away from all this seeing, like, that's the best you got? Really? Like, you're throwing everything you can at every little crack and nook and cranny of the gospel that you think people have up on their shelf. Here's your list. That's it? That's how I come away with this stuff. All right, let's move on beyond the Book of Mormon. Let's go to the first vision, because again, if we can undermine the Book of Mormon, we can undermine Joseph and therefore undermine everything, right? That's the argument of the critics. But why not just go straight to Joseph Smith? He claimed, this whole thing got started with what's called the first vision, where he claims to have seen God the Father and Jesus Christ. And so if we can undermine that, if we can show, the critics argue, if we can show that Joseph didn't actually see God and Jesus Christ, if we can show that he lied, if he's making it up, then we can taint everything that he did. So here's Gordon B. Hinckley on the same topic. Our whole strength rests on the validity of that first vision. It either occurred or it did not occur. If it did not, then this work is a fraud. If it did, then it is the most important and wonderful work under the heavens. Okay, so that is what the CES letter and many other critics are trying to do here with the first vision in the arguments and criticisms that they bring up. That is to impugn the work, to paint it as a fraud by showing that this foundational experience did not happen, that Joseph was making it up. For example, the CES letter claims that there are about 10 versions of Joseph Smith's version that evolved. They claim that there are 10 versions, 4 main ones that they highlight in the letter, but they say that there's 10. Well, this is misleading, unsurprisingly. There are no versions, quote unquote. There are simply different historical accounts of that experience related by Joseph to different people or audiences at different times. And so the differences between the so-called versions are not unexpected in the sense that when you're telling the same story about what happened in your life to your parents versus bearing your testimony at church versus writing about it in the newspaper versus teaching your kids about it versus telling your parents about it, whatever that experience is in your life, you are likely to emphasize and even omit different aspects based on the audience and based on how long it has been since the experience. I do this. We all do this. This is the human experience. We remember things differently over time. So, for example, in the first vision, there are several key aspects that are in these retellings of the first vision. Joseph says in various of them, for example, I'll stick with the four main ones that the CES letter, they have this little graphic. Oh, look, and they kind of mix and match like, oh, he said this in this one, but not this one. And they're trying to visually show the contrast or the differences between these to somehow show that Joseph was making it up along the way, right? So out of the kind of key four that are highlighted, Joseph said in three of them that his sins that he was told in the vision that his sins were forgiven. He's told in two of them that, or he says in two of them that he saw two personages. In two of them, he says that he saw a host of angels. In one of them, he says he saw God the Father. In two of them, he says he saw Jesus Christ. In one of them, he talks about an angelic being. In two of them, he talks about how he was told that all churches are wrong. In one of them, he talks about a pillar of fire, which is stupid because in another one of the four, it talks about a pillar of light, but the CES letter does not count that for a second reference because apparently a pillar of light and a pillar of fire is two separate, and clearly, like you can see, they're not being honest dealers of information here. It's ridiculous how they do this. One of these four accounts, one of these four mentions of the first vision that the CES letter is using, again, visually, they kind of show these red X's. Oh, he didn't mention this in this telling of the vision, and he didn't mention these other four things. He said that over here in this other one, but one of these four is from an 1835 journal entry comprising only 9 words. A brief journal entry about Joseph's experience, super brief journal entry, that contains only 9 words. And here the CES letter is trying to say, oh, but look, he's making it up because in that version of the first vision, he's not mentioning all these other things. It's a friggin' 9-word journal entry. Just crazy. Differences in the retelling of the first vision are not unexpected. In fact, there are other scriptural examples. In Paul's vision on the road to Damascus, we see the same thing, different things emphasized, different things shared. Or in the apostles' experience on the Mount of Transfiguration, again, different things are emphasized or omitted or included. We don't read those New Testament things and say, they're making it up because Matthew or Luke wrote it down differently, right? Like, let's at least be consistent in how we approach historical retellings of events. Take 9/11. This was an example I found online that someone, when they were responding to this criticism, they shared this example of 9/11. How, I guess, Seth MacFarlane, as one example, that they showed these two side-by-side comparisons, just as the CES letter is doing with the first vision. Oh, look, they mentioned it here, but not here, and over here he mentioned this. And so they have this example with Seth MacFarlane's story about where he was on 9/11. This very public story that he's shared, this American Airlines, he was supposed to be on the American Airlines flight, which was flown into the North Tower. So this is like, whoa, crazy, right? He was supposed to be on that flight. And he's a famous actor and director and all the rest. And so his story has been very public. Well, there's 2 interviews that this individual put side by side to show. One with Piers Morgan, one with Adam Carolla. I don't know what the dates are on these 2 different interviews. So then he says, okay, here's these 2 interviews that Seth MacFarlane did about his experience with 9/11. And let's look at his 2 interviews and pick out the key elements of the story that he's sharing. For example, he starts with the reason why he was late for his flight. Well, in one interview, he said it's because he gave a lecture, then went out and got drunk. In the second, he says that he gave a lecture. But why did he omit in one that he got drunk, right? Scheduling discrepancy. In one interview, he says it was a 10-minute discrepancy. In the other, he says it was 30. In one story, he mentions a driver. In the other, he doesn't. Which tower was going to get hit by the plane? Well, in one interview, he said it was the second tower. That was the flight he was supposed to be on. In the other, he said it was the first plane for the North Tower. His response to missing the flight? In one interview, he said, I'll hang out and take the 11 a.m. flight. On another interview, he says his response was, I'm hungover. I'll get the 11 o'clock flight. Then he goes and he gets a drink and he's talking to the bartender. And in one version of the story, he says to the bartender, he later tells that he had said to the bartender, hey, can you pour me a shot? But in the second, he said, too early for a scotch? Now here's an example where this guy, like his first interview, it's videotaped. If he's making this up, he can be very consistent if he wants to, recalling very specific details to be internally consistent with. No one is arguing that Seth MacFarlane did not have the experience he did on 9/11, that he missed the flight and that, he was in a cab and went out and got drunk and so forth, right? Or was drunk the night before, went out and had a drink. No one is arguing that didn't happen, right? Or George Bush, like his response to 9/11, like humans tell things different ways to different people over time. This is normal. This is why eyewitness testimony has the problems that it does. Think of like Ferguson, right? The witnesses at Ferguson were wildly inconsistent with one another. Or people on a police lineup, right? They say, oh, I think that's the guy that did it. They're going from memory, which just changes and gets fuzzy over time. Apparently, there's a term for this called the Rashomon effect from a Japanese movie in which they depict like the same event, but from the perspective of 4 different eyewitnesses or whatever. And so it's very different because they're each bringing their own biases and poor memory and subjective interpretation to the same event. And so it's 4 different things. So from the title of that movie comes the name of this effect, the Rashomon effect, which describes how parties, individuals, describe an event in a different and contradictory manner, which reflects their subjective interpretation and self-interested advocacy rather than an objective truth. So then the CES letter says, oh, okay, well, fine. Like, let's set that argument aside. Let's go on to the next because it's a Gish gallop and we just got to throw a bunch of arguments at you. So they say, or Jeremy says and his ex-Mormon subreddit buddies, the first and earliest written account of the first vision in Joseph Smith's journal was 12 years after the spring of 1820. There is absolutely no record of any claimed first vision prior to this 1832 account. The allegation is that he made it up over a decade later as he's starting this church because he needed a Genesis story. He needed something to kind of say, here's what happened and why you should follow me as a prophet. That is the allegation. Well, this 1832 version, written by Joseph Smith in his journal, was a rough draft, not meant for any publication. It's one of his first journal entries. He was given a journal. It's shortly after he received a revelation in which he was commanded, this is now in D&C 20, commanded to keep a record of the restoration, to basically start a written history. Joseph was not doing this before. Why are there no records, no documents before 1832 in which Joseph is describing the first vision? It's because we have hardly any documents from Joseph's own, written by his own hand or from his own story before 1832. He didn't write things down. He didn't record things. He didn't have a personal journal. He didn't like to write. He's an uneducated farm boy, for crying out loud. Writing did not come easily, so neither did speaking. He found it much easier to let others do the writing and he would just dictate, which is why he so often had scribes throughout his life. This is from one of the people replying to the CS letter, said the 1832's the earliest written account where Joseph Smith records his own birthday. Should we assume that until 1832, nobody in his family knew when his birthday was? Or better yet, that he made up his birthday too? So again, just because 1832 is the first written record we have of what Joseph experienced in 1820 does not mean that it didn't happen. There are credible reasons, arguments as to why there were no written records before. It's because this guy is an ignorant, uneducated farm boy who can't write well and hates doing it, doesn't own a journal. It's not in his family experience or culture at the time. So, gee, shock that he wasn't writing things down, before then. It's just silly. Like you read these arguments and you're like, again, this is the best you got. I come away yet again from reading these and other arguments against Joseph's first vision, and all I see is desperation. I see people trying to justify their decisions as best they can, trying to give themselves an out, trying to retaliate and lash out at a church they no longer believe in and that they ascribe to the many bad things that have happened in their life. And yes, I'm generalizing, but I see desperation, because I come away from these and other arguments thinking, I'm sorry, but that's extremely weak. Like you're Gish galloping, you're machine gunning all these arguments, and that one fails, and that one fails, and that one fails, and that's misleading, and that's untruthful, and that's ridiculous, and that's easily disprovable. And again, it's like, come at me, bro. Is this the best you got? Like, if this is what's on people's shelf, breaking their shelf, like, let's do a little bit of research and spend a little time with this information to see how ridiculous it is. I'm not going to go into polygamy. The CS letter talks all about it. How dare Joseph do these things? How could he do this? And all, I've done a whole nother musing on polygamy a few months ago. I would invite you, if you haven't listened to that, to rewind and go back and listen to that one. Talked all about polygamy and why the conventional interpretation of what Joseph was actually doing is wrong. Even the church's own position, I disagree with. I don't think that there is the validity of D&C 132 that people claim there is. I think there was Joseph and Emma were actually fighting polygamy, and only after he died did some of these people who were secretly practicing polygamy ascribe it to Joseph and say he was teaching us in secret and all of this kind of stuff. There is zero evidence that Joseph fathered any children, whereas all the other early church leaders who were wanting to get into polygamy over Joseph's and Emma's protestations, they clearly fathered a ton of people. Joseph never did. Joseph, here he is restoring this doctrine. He's teaching this idea of sealing, of connecting families, connecting people to him, trying to get them into heaven, and people are equating that eternal sealing with a carnal sexual marriage relationship when there's no evidence of that. And I think the evidence points in the other direction. And so all of the CES letter garbage about polygamy and all these like, oh, horrible person, relies on, I think, a misinterpretation and a misunderstanding of what was actually going on. So if you would like more information on the polygamy stuff and you didn't hear that last musing, you can go back and do that. The final one that I'm going to share from these many criticisms is the Book of Abraham. This is one where I've had many people that I've spoken with personally over the years talking about what's on their shelf. They'll concede a point here, they'll admit some nuance there, they'll express some uncertainty there, but in their mind, the Book of Abraham seals the deal. That is the shelf breaker, because there's like no way that what Joseph said is accurate. And they will use these claims about the Book of Abraham as the basis to just say, that broke my shelf, I'm out of the church, I no longer believe it anymore. So let's dig into it. Again, I'm not going to be exhaustive here. After this example, I'll point you to the website and tell you what I think you ought to do or should consider doing. So stick around. But I'm just going to highlight a few examples to show, again, a pattern of deception, a pattern of duplicitousness, and that this is indicative of so many of the other claims and arguments being made, both in the CES letter, but also more broadly. So, very briefly, what is the Book of Abraham? How did we get this thing? In the summer of 1835, there was a man named Michael Chandler. He arrives in Kirtland with some mummies and some papyrus scrolls in his possession, and he was offering to sell them. He was like a traveling salesman. There were no sarcophagi, is that the plural? There were no caskets. These were like just awkwardly mummified human bodies that they would just prop up against the wall. They were found 35 years prior, or roughly around there in the early 1800s in Egypt. This guy Chandler, who had them in his possession, he claimed to be the nephew of the guy who dug them up. Turns out that wasn't actually true. That other guy's name was Antonio Labello. He claims that he was his nephew. Turns out that's not accurate. He was working, this Labello guy, how did he get the mummies and the papyri? He was working with someone on the dig named Bernardino Drovetti. And this dig supposedly unearthed hundreds of mummies. I mean, some think it's like one of the largest discoveries of mummies and papyri in history. So this guy Drovetti, who's there at the dig in Egypt, he takes most of these items into his possession, but Labello, this other guy, kept a few for himself. They were sent to the United States. They were sent to these traveling salesmen kind of going around on tour and then sold off to anyone willing to pay enough. So eventually, this guy Chandler, who arrives in Kirtland in 1835, this guy Chandler gets these remaining items, and a group of Latter-day Saints ends up buying 4 mummies and at least 5 papyri on behalf of the church for about $2,400. Granted, that was, $2,400 at the time, which was probably like $100,000 today or something much higher. So Joseph takes possession of the items. These people buy it. They want it in the possession of the church. Joseph takes possession. Now, Joseph is distracted with a lot of stuff going on, both persecution and translation work and all this stuff. So it takes him a few years to kind of work through the papyri. And what he comes out on the other end with is what we call today, what we have in our Pearl of Great Price, the Book of Abraham. So here's from the CES letter about the Book of Abraham. Their quote: "Despite Joseph's claim that this record was written by Abraham, quote, by his own hand upon papyrus, scholars have found the original papyrus Joseph translated and have dated it in 1st century after Christ, nearly 2,000 years after Abraham could have written it." So here they're trying to say, well, Joseph said Abraham wrote it by his own hand on papyrus, but the carbon dating or the whatever on the papyrus doesn't work out. So immediately at the outset, they're trying to show that this is a forgery, that this is not what Joseph claimed it was. Therefore, he's a false prophet, and therefore this Book of Abraham that he came up with is utter nonsense. Again, going at the foundation, trying to say if I can get someone on this argument, the rest just is irrelevant. Right? Who cares about all the other stuff? Because if he's wrong at the outset, then who cares what comes after that? But that phrase that Joseph used, by his own hand upon papyrus, very well likely refers to the original record. What the eventual papyrus was is likely a recopying from some other scribe or someone else, just as early church leaders and scribes and priests and others for millennia copied the early apostolic letters. When we read in the New Testament that Paul's saying, I write unto you, he didn't write that actual thing. That was a transcription of a translation of a recopying of 40 other recopyings, because people were writing these things and creating duplicates. They didn't have friggin', Xerox machines to copy these documents for people. And so who cares that it was dated to the 1st century after Christ? That doesn't mean that the text that's on that document didn't come from the original papyrus that Abraham at one point wrote. I mean, we say that Mormon wrote the Book of Mormon. Doesn't mean he wrote the English version. If I were to go grab my Book of Mormon over here and hold it up, it doesn't mean that Mormon wrote that very English version. It means he wrote the source material from which this was copied and then translated and then copied and so forth, right? Then the CES letter claims, the original papyrus Joseph translated has since been found. Aha! We can now verify if what Joseph Smith claims to have done was actually done, because the original papyrus that Joseph translated has been found. This too is I'll call it a partial truth, a very, very, very partial truth, because it is mostly inaccurate to say that we have the original papyrus that Joseph translated from. Why? Because after Emma sold off the papyrus and the mummies, because these weird dead bodies are in her home, and it changes hands and it gets donated to a museum, ends up in a Chicago museum and burns down in a fire in 1871, I want to say. So there was this roll. Witnesses repeatedly talk about this roll of papyrus. And that roll is what made its way into the possession of Chicago Museum. That roll is what burned up and we no longer have. What we do have are the frayed, what do they call it? Kind of like burned or charred edges of the papyrus that were removed from the roll and encased in glass to protect them because they were kind of this flimsy outer edge that needed, some protection. And so it's these fragments that the church received from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, because again, they kind of got donated around over the decades after Emma. The church got these from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1967. They were then immediately published in the 1968 issue of the Improvement Era, the church's magazine, and stated on the front page of the article that they were Egyptian funeral texts. This is important because in the next portion I'll read, they're going to try and claim, oh, look, this is just a funerary text. It's not this Book of Abraham thing, right? And so elsewhere in the CES letter, they claim that it's this big church cover-up, that Joseph has this Book of Abraham. It has no connection at all to the original papyrus. Therefore, the church is covering it up because they don't want people to know that there's such a massive disconnect. The church, months after they acquired the papyrus fragments, publishes in the Improvement Era this rediscovery. Hey, we found these again. They're openly saying, here's what it is, and it is these funerary texts. Okay, so let's get to that point. The CES letter says, and I quote, Egyptologists have found the source material for the Book of Abraham to be nothing more than a common pagan Egyptian funerary text for a deceased man named Hor, H-O-R, in the 1st century. In other words, it was a common breathing permit that the Egyptians buried with their dead. It has absolutely nothing to do with Abraham or anything Joseph claimed in his translation for the Book of Abraham. Oh, wow, really? Maybe I shouldn't believe in Joseph as the prophet anymore if this papyrus we have access to clearly shows just a boring, normal funeral, and he claimed it was this Book of Abraham. I mean, that's what they're trying to get reactions from people. And frankly, a lot of people have that reactions because they're not taking the time to challenge what they're seeing here. They're not taking the time to go review the abundant evidence that pushes back on all this nonsense. They accept it at face value and out they go to the church. It's just mind-boggling that people would throw it all away because some crackpot and all his buddies on Reddit try and create this Gish gallop to machine gun you. So, number one, in no case do we have a complete record of what Joseph Smith had. What we have are fragments. The roll, this lengthy papyrus, when you unroll it, was burned. We have fragments. So to claim that Egyptologists have found that this thing on this fragment does not match the text from the book, it's ridiculous. The CES letter does not acknowledge that there's a ton of other material that was burned up. They're trying to argue that the Book of Abraham does not equal the fragment because Egyptologists show that it's inaccurate, right? Okay, so here's a little portion to quote from. By 1836, after much moving and handling, the papyri had suffered damage to the outer edges of the rolls. A transcription of portions of the roll, probably done in 1835, show squiggle marks used to indicate the edge of the papyrus, showing that portions had already come loose. That the papyri were beginning to break into little pieces is demonstrated by the tiny fragments patched in the wrong places in the mounted papyri. The backing paper is dated to the Kirtland period. Only the damaged outer portions of the rolls were mounted on paper. The remainder of the papyri, still being in relatively good condition, were left as rolls. This explains all the eyewitness reports and the remaining physical evidence. Joseph Smith's own concern was shown when he committed the Egyptian antiquities into the hands of Joseph Coe, who had assisted in their purchase, in February of 1836. Quote, I complied with his request and only observed that they must be managed with prudence and care, especially the manuscripts. The present Joseph Smith papyri all come from these mounted little fragments from the ends of the rolls. None of the rolls have been preserved. So, again, wildly inaccurate for the CES letter to claim, Egyptologists show that give me a break. There's tons of other papyrus that was burned up we no longer have access to, so to hide that fact, to try and show a disconnect is completely deceptive. Next point. They show this. They show facsimile 1, which was the supposed funerary, image of the deceased person laying on his back on this lion desk thing, and the kind of bird floating in the air. You've seen this. It's in the back. It's in the Pearl of Great Price, facsimile 1, and there's a what Joseph called the idolatrous priest who's going to try and kill Abraham, who's tied to the altar. So the CES letter says, the following is a side-by-side comparison of what Joseph Smith translated in facsimile 1 versus what it actually says according to Egyptologists and modern Egyptology. So they show facsimile 1, and then they show on the left what Joseph Smith claimed, because it's numbered, right? Number 1, 2, 3, and they have these numbers tied to each of the little aspects of the illustration. So Joseph has his definition, and then on the right we have the quote-unquote modern Egyptological interpretation. That's important, as I'll mention in a moment. So this is the only facsimile that we have the original copy of, by the way, from these fragments. We don't have the originals of the other facsimiles anymore. First, this assumes that Joseph translated the facsimile the way that modern Egyptologists do, in that he looked at the document and he's looking at each particular character and translating from each image and each character into a different language. Nowhere in Joseph's experience was that how he translated. When Joseph, quote unquote, translated the Old Testament, he simply looked at pages of Genesis in his King James Bible, and then he dictated the book of Moses by inspiration. I mean, the book of Moses is intricate and complex and fascinating, and there was no source document beyond Joseph simply reading the King James Version and then producing by inspiration and revelation the so-called translation of the book of Moses. That's how Joseph Smith likely, I think, looked at the papyri and translated it, quote unquote. If this is true, we wouldn't need the actual text of the book of Abraham to be on the fragment. It could be that the roll had the actual text of Abraham, that the book of Abraham comes from information written on the burned up rolls. That's very plausible, but we can't prove it because we don't have the rolls anymore. But it's just as possible that Joseph didn't need any of these words to actually be on the papyrus, because he wasn't reading character by character the gold plates of the Book of Mormon, right? He wasn't doing it. He was using the Urim and Thummim. He's looking at these rocks. He's just getting these words, this unlearned farm boy, creating this highly intercomplex, crazy book. So too with the book of Moses. He just reads the Old Testament and says, okay, here's what Moses actually said. The so-called Joseph Smith Matthew and the Joseph Smith translation of the New Testament, same thing. Just like, nope, here's what it actually says. So too with the book of Abraham. Here's D&C 7. If you read the preface of the 7th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, it says this: revelation given to Joseph Smith, the prophet, and Oliver Cowdery at Harmony, Pennsylvania, April 1829, when they inquired through the Urim and Thummim as to whether John, the beloved disciple, tarried in the flesh or had died. Is John still alive or is he dead? It continues. The revelation is a translated version of the record made on parchment by John and hidden up by himself. D&C 7, the Doctrine and Covenants, section 7, is a translated version of parchment that John made and hid. Joseph had zero access to that document, and yet we have the 7th section of the Doctrine and Covenants by revelation through the Urim and Thummim. Joseph did not need source text, so it doesn't matter. Like the papyrus ultimately doesn't matter. Joseph could have just produced the book of Abraham and said, here's this revelation I've been given. Now, he had the gold plates there before him, and so he used that, in a sense, to produce the Book of Mormon. He read the Old Testament, we get the Book of Moses. He read the New Testament, we get the Joseph Smith translations, right? It could just be that his kind of promptings and triggers, or whatever you want to call it, his proximity to the papyri were sufficient to provoke a question in his mind, to go to God and then receive revelation of saying, here's what Abraham actually said. Okay, there's a lot more. I'm just gonna try and wind this down because I could go down the Book of Abraham rabbit hole. I have a lot of other stuff prepared. One more quick thing. Do you remember on figure one, you've got this figure, the idolatrous priest, as Joseph said, and he's holding this like sword or knife or something, and Abraham's kind of laying there on the altar, right? Well, oh, oh gosh, there's so many fun little zings to put in there to show how ridiculous the CES letter is. The person that they're relying upon to give the official Egyptological interpretation of what's happening on Facsimile 1 is a guy named Kevin Matthey, who is a professional composer, music director, and pianist who has more than 25 years experience working in the music industry. So this guy has some opinions, and he's an amateur, whatever, Egyptologist, that's fine. He publishes some stuff, and CES Letter is using this as the convincing interpretation of what's actually in Facsimile 1. Like even if it's true, again, what I said a moment ago applies. Joseph doesn't need Facsimile 1 to have said or intended exactly what he says. And Egypt, like their characters and art, were subject to a wide number of interpretations. So to say that there is one interpretation of Facsimile 1 or other Egyptian art is ridiculous because there's any number of interpretations. That's like saying when I translate something from English to Spanish or Spanish to English, since I know both languages, that there is only one definition. But anyone who translates things knows that you can choose any number of words to get at the underlying meaning. There is no official interpretation, let alone one from a professional composer and music director. So then we go to Facsimile 1, and Abraham's on the bed, and you've got all these claims that it's all a fraud or whatever. And in the CES letter, they say, they have this depiction of Facsimile 1 with some modifications. And they say, this is what it is actually supposed to look like, quote, based on Egyptology and the same scene discovered elsewhere in Egypt. So they're taking Facsimile 1, and then he says, well, if you go look at what we see elsewhere in Egypt, Facsimile 1 should look like this. The guy who's standing should have this kind of headdress on of whatever the god is. I can't remember the false god, and you should make these changes and these changes. Well, the guy who drew this in the CES letter of what Facsimile 1 should look like, his name's Charles Larson. He's not an Egyptologist. He's a former corrections officer that has a degree in history and anthropology. And so the CES letter is saying, here's this official Egyptological interpretation of what Facsimile 1 should look like if it were accurate. And they're using some random amateur as the basis to debunk it. It's just asinine. But let's drill down more deeply. To say that this same scene is discovered elsewhere in Egypt is false. What you do see in these kind of funerary burial type images is, yes, a priest standing over, yes, a body that is on a table, yes. However, in all of the other ones, the body on the table is a sarcophagus. It's not a body in mummified form. It's not naked, right? Whereas in Facsimile 1, you don't have this mummy in a sarcophagus as you do in all of the other images from Egypt. What you have in Facsimile 1 is someone who's still alive. His hands are raised in the air. One of his legs is raised. This is someone trying to fight back. This is not like all the other ones in Egypt because none of the other ones have that imagery in it. This is something distinct. And the CES letter and all these critics don't want you to know that. They want you to assume that, oh, this is a forgery because it's supposed to look like these other ones. No, it's not. In fact, even in our Facsimile 1, when you look at the image there, it's actually inaccurate. What you see there in your scriptures is an engraving that was made. It's a replication of an engraving that was made using that fragment of the papyrus where we see the image of what's in Facsimile 1. Problem is some of it's penciled in because the papyrus in these parts was burned or ripped off or whatever. And so like the head of the priest and, the upper body of Abraham and stuff, there's chunks missing. So someone, we don't know who, could have been Joseph, could have been a scribe, could have been someone else, kind of penciled in what they thought it would look like. Turns out the head of the priest, they were kind of wrong about. If you go look at it, it actually, is extremely likely that the original papyrus did have the Egyptian weird headdress. I can't remember who it is. Blah, blah, blah. The jackal-headed Egyptian god of death. So in all these other images, you've got this, jackal-looking god, and they're preparing the body of the deceased, right? It appears, if you go look at it closely, the fragment of the papyrus did indeed have the jackal-looking head, like all the other Egyptian ones. It's just that was removed, and whoever drew in pencil just drew a person's normal head, which is what we now see in our official facsimile 1. So that's an inaccuracy. Additionally, what you see in facsimile 1 is that the priest, the idolatrous priest who's trying to kill Abraham, is standing on the other side of the table, away from the view of the drawing. So in the background, we've got the priest, and then in between us and him, as viewers of this image, we have the table. So priest and then table. However, if you look at the original papyrus, you see something different. The priest is actually standing in between the table and Abraham's legs. So in other words, he's standing next to the table, but between the table and Abraham's legs. We see in the foreground Abraham's legs, and then we see the body of the priest, and then we see the table. So that's an error in the etching that was made and what we now have in facsimile 1. This further shows that Abraham was alive and struggling, and what that has in facsimile 1 is not what is in all these other Egyptian official, funerary drawings. It's completely different. You see a priest on one side or the other, this jackal-headed priest, and he's just attending to the body of the dead person on the table. This, in facsimile 1, is someone who's alive, who's struggling, and the priest is getting between this guy's legs and the table, trying to kill him. So, I'm going to wrap it there. There's so many other things to say. But the point is, the Book of Abraham, for a lot of people, is a shelf breaker, because they buy into this garbage. They say, oh, it's not from the papyrus. Joseph Smith made it up. Well, it's how he, quote unquote, made up. It's how he translated everything that he did. Why are you treating the Book of Abraham any different? At least in that case, there was papyrus. In the Book of Moses, all he used was the Old Testament. For his Joseph Smith translations, all he used was the New Testament. And yes, there were gold plates for the Book of Mormon, so there was a physical object of the original record there. But the point is, it is inconsistent to apply criticisms to the Book of Abraham when Joseph Smith's method of translation did not require him to have the source text, because he wasn't translating. He wasn't looking at an Egyptian hieroglyph and then saying, is that an R or an L? Oh, okay. He wasn't translating in the conventional sense that we understand the term. He wasn't using the gold plates from Mormon and Moroni. He wasn't going word by word to decipher what they meant and tell us, or his scribes, which word that one is and that one is. He wasn't translating in the conventional sense. He was receiving through revelation these highly complex, amazing, theologically intricate, philosophically deep texts that we now have in both the Book of Mormon and in the Pearl of Great Price, and in the Doctrine of Covenants in section 7 with John's parchment that, poof, he just got through the Urim and Thummim. Joseph's work did not require him to have any of this. And yet the CS letter idiots are these, let me be more compassionate, these misguided individuals, formerly of our faith, who try to pick at all of these little aspects of the gospel, raise all these questions, sow all these doubts, official Egyptologists that are actually music composers, and all these ridiculous things that are being made up, distilled into this document to machine gun at someone with this Gish gallop approach and just overwhelm them with all these things. And it has created carnage, spiritual carnage. I know many people whose shelf has broken because they encounter all these things and just throw up their hands and say, oh, guess it's not true because no one can refute that. That is false. So here's where the website is that I'll recommend. If you're curious about anything that I brought up today, and I've only brought up like 4% of the material that's out there, I encourage you to go to this website, debunking-cesletter.com. debunking-cesletter.com. So again, the CES letter was created by Jeremy and all of his ex-Mormon buddies on Reddit. And it's this and by the way, he's edited over time because he's had to like remove things because in the original letter, there were complete inaccuracies. And so when he got challenged, he had to remove those. And the original letter that he wrote had this very like angry tone to it, very kind of bitter. He's softened that a lot for the express purpose that he has stated that he's not going to be as persuasive to people and influence people as much if he had that type of tone. And so they went in and sanitized this, and they're trying to, again, portray this as a sincere list of unanswered questions. It is garbage. It is a compilation of the internet's best criticisms from ex-Mormons, and they are so flimsy. All you have to do is spend a little bit of time digging into it. That is why this website I want to promote is helpful. Debunking-cesletter.com. There are 3 or 4 separate responses on this website. There's one on Reddit from the LDS forum where someone went in, and that if you want to go down the rabbit hole and be very exhaustive with this, choose the Reddit version. Very thorough, very lengthy, very detailed, all organized by topic. So if you want to focus on the Book of Mormon, you can focus there. You want to focus on polygamy, fine, whatever. So if you want details, go to the Reddit one. I would recommend you start with Jim Bennett's, which is funny for me because Jim Bennett is the son of former Senator Bob Bennett, who I helped get kicked out of office after all the TARP bailouts and silly shenanigans that he and Congress were involved in. And I was on Mike Lee's campaign in 2009 and 10, and there were like a dozen other candidates or whatever. Mike made it through the primary after defeating Bob Bennett at convention. Well, Jim Bennett was on his dad's campaign and helping, and so he and I were on opposite sides, and he then went here in Utah and started the Utah United Party, which is for a bunch of like moderate Democrats and Republicans to get together. And so he and I definitely would not and do not see eye to eye politically. But theologically, dude, his response to the CES letter is excellent. It is entertaining, and it is at a more simple level. It's long because the CES letter is long, but he goes line by line through the CES letter to just poke back at it. And it's such an effective way because he's using humor. He's been a little bit snarky. It is a fun read. So, if you want a serious, scholarly, whatever, there are other ones. FAIR has theirs. They took the PDF of the CES letter, and then they just added annotations on there with links. Like, oh, this is wrong, go here. Oh, here's a website that explains why this is misleading. And so if you want a line-by-line kind of apologetic rebuttal, use the FAIR one. If you want a lot of depth with a lot of links to other sources, go to the Reddit version. But I would recommend starting with Jim Bennett's. Just sit down and you can just read it. You don't have to click anything. You just read, and it is funny. Dude's got a great sense of humor, and I would recommend starting there. All of those resources can be found, again, at debunking-cesletter.com. My invitation to you, my challenge to you, is first of all, only take on what you're comfortable with. Right? I added a qualifier at the beginning of this musing because not everyone is at the spiritual level to be able to confront all these other historical and doctrinal type of things. So I wanted to say, hey, look, here's the manner in which I'm going to be presenting these things. Viewer beware, right? Just have caution for your own spiritual level. If you're a brand new convert or whatever, right? Just go at your pace. Don't run faster than you have strength. But if you're listening to this, chances are you prefer the meat of the gospel to the milk of the gospel because it's what I've been kind of dishing up. And so if you keep coming back for more, chances are you can handle this. I don't recommend just going and reading the CES letter on its own or any of these kind of other anti-Mormon websites or books because it's without context, it's without contrasting information, it's without rebuttals. Why not read the two together to kind of see point and counterpoint? The whole point of the CES letter is not, and other criticisms, is not to construct a theory. They have no theory as to how the Book of Mormon exists. They have no theory as to how Joseph produced all this stuff when he was an ignorant farm boy. The critics have no way to say, here is what plausibly happened. All they are doing is trying to tear down the claims that we have of how it did happen. They can just tear down, not build up. They're not building anything up. They're not advancing any other positive reasons or theories as to how this stuff all materialized. All they're doing is trying to challenge the official narrative or the actual reality of what happened. And so all it is these Gish gallop machine gun, attacks. And man, just spend some time reading these resources and start small. You don't need to read all this stuff. You don't need to have an exhaustive review. Pick whatever topic you're interested in, right? Let's say it's the Book of Mormon, and just focus on the Book of Mormon aspects of the criticisms and the rebuttals. And if you use some of these resources that I've mentioned on debunking-cesletter.com, I think you will come away, as I have, with my faith being even more affirmed. Over the years, contrary to what my mom and many others have said, right? Don't read that stuff. Don't go down those paths. I read it all. I've looked into it all. I'm very familiar with all the arguments, all the claims, all the criticisms. And yet, I think they are extremely weak. I think most of them are dishonest and deceptive. I think, yes, there's questions. Yes, there's unanswered things. Yes, there's things on my shelf, so-called, right? But that doesn't mean that all of these criticisms that are causing other people's faith crises are valid. So many of them are not. And when I read something, if I read a book, and I'm reading through that book, and there are like consistent factual errors, if again and again I'm reading inaccuracies in this book, and it's clear that the author is just making stuff up or trying to be deceptive, I'm not going to keep reading that book. I am not going to recommend it to others. I am not going to consider that a trustworthy resource for whatever the topic is. I'm going to discard it. And so when you look at things like the CES letter, some of these other resources, when you start to see how disingenuous and deceptive so many of these criticisms and claims are, in my mind, even if there are 1 or 2 or 10 things in there that are valid questions, unanswered questions, things we still are kind of working on or trying to learn about or whatever, even if there's some validity in there, I think the legitimacy of the overall effort is completely undermined with how intentionally and frequently deceptive so many of these arguments are. I've shared but a few. There are many others. So I encourage you to go there, do your own homework as best you feel comfortable with. But I come away from all this after years of doing this. This is not a recent thing. I've read a lot of this stuff and apologetics and all these different people for, 15, 20 years. I come away even more strongly with a belief that Joseph did what he said he did, that he is who he says he was, that he had the experiences that he claimed, that he was a prophet of God in the truest sense of the word. I have no other plausible explanation. I think there are no other valid theories that anyone has advanced, and the so-called criticisms largely do not withstand scrutiny. To me, that is faith affirming. To me, it is consistent with what I have researched and believe, and I come away from all of this from an even stronger testimony that Joseph did restore the gospel of Jesus Christ. As you all know, from all these musings and whatever, I am often critical of people of our faith and in our church because I don't think we're living up to the standards. Joseph himself said it. As he would introduce Revelations, the saints would fly to pieces like glass, and how difficult it is to get the saints, including me, to, shape up and do what we're told and actually follow the gospel that we claim to. But I believe that Joseph was absolutely sincere and authentic. I think the Book of Mormon and the Book of Moses and the Book of Abraham and D&C 7 and Joseph Smith, Matthew, and all these things came through the power of God, not through transliteration, not through a careful word by word or letter by letter translation like you or I might do with language, but through the power of God. I know of no other plausible explanation, and I think as I read these things, they do come from God. So I think that the more I learn about these criticisms and the shallow nature of so many of them gives me even more confidence in my position. When the best arguments that can be crowdsourced from the internet after years and years and years of doing this cannot withstand any decent amount of scrutiny. See you next week.